The final day of Tyler James Robinson's sentencing unfolded with a gravity that was impossible to ignore. Inside the Provo courthouse, security was at its peak. Metal detectors, armed deputies, and controlled access ensured that only authorized individuals could enter the courtroom. Reporters, political observers, family members, and national media representatives filled every seat as anticipation mounted. When Robinson entered the chamber under police escort, the crowd fell completely silent. His demeanor was noticeably different from his earlier video appearances. Gone was the distant look of a man viewed through a screen and wrapped in suicide prevention attire. In person, his shoulders slumped, and his expression was drained, reflecting the full weight of what awaited him. Seated next to his public defender, he avoided looking at anyone in the gallery. Judge Tony Graf opened the session with formalities, summarizing the charges and noting the prosecution's long-standing request for the death penalty. Prosecutor Jeff Gray and his team sat poised with documents and evidence files, prepared for the final declaration. The judge's tone remained steady, but the air in the courtroom felt heavy, as if every breath marked a turning point. Observers described the silence as suffocating, broken only by the sound of journalists scribbling notes. Supporters of Charlie Kirk, many wearing turning point USA. Pin snitwin same, rain chanintim remained still, locking their focus on the bench. On the opposite side, Robinson's parents sat quietly, their expressions a mix of fear, sorrow, and resignation. For the dramatic collapse that would later dominate headlines, the atmosphere felt historic. Everyone present sensed they were witnessing the closing act of a case that had already reshaped national discourse about political violence. What began as a legal proceeding had become a symbolic moment for a country wrestling with extremism, justice, and public safety. As the proceedings moved forward, Judge Tony Graf began outlining the court's reasoning behind the final sentence. His tone was controlled but direct, emphasizing the severity of the crime and its broader social impact. The prosecution had consistently argued for capital punishment, pointing to the political nature of the assassination, the premeditation involved, and the trauma inflicted on the thousands of witnesses present at Utah Valley University that day. Their case leaned heavily on Robinson's digital confessions and the disturbing details engraved on his ammunition, evidence they presented as undeniable proof of intent. The defense countered with arguments for leniency, citing Robinson's youth, lack of criminal history, and alleged ideological disillusionment. They portrayed him as someone influenced by extreme narratives rather than a lifelong violent offender. Still, their plea was overshadowed by the scale and symbolism of the attack, as well as Robinson's own written record. When Judge Graf finally declared that the state would move forward with the death penalty, the courtroom held its breath. Robinson's reaction was immediate and visible. His posture shifted, his breathing became unsteady, and before anyone could intervene, he collapsed to the floor beside the defense table. Deputies and medical staff rushed forward, quickly removing him from the chamber for emergency attention. The interruption was brief but unforgettable. Spectators described the moment as surreal, an emotional and physical breaking point in a case already defined by intensity. Despite the fall, the sentence remained unchanged. Judge Graf reaffirmed that the ruling would stand and that the legal process had reached its final conclusion. Within minutes, the dramatic collapse became headline material. For those inside the courtroom, it was less spectacle and more a stark reminder of the human tension behind a nationally decisive moment. The silence that followed lingered long after Robinson was taken out. The shock of Tyler Robinson's collapse did nothing to slow the spread of reactions across the courtroom and beyond. Almost immediately after he was escorted out for medical attention, the ruling began to sink in with everyone present. Supporters of Charlie Kirk, many of whom had waited months for justice, saw the sentence as a long-awaited resolution. Some described the moment as closure, while others viewed Robinson's collapse as a symbolic consequence of his actions. Outside the courthouse, Emotions were equally intense and deeply divided. Members of Turning Point USA and Kirk supporters gathered with signs reading "Justice for Charlie" and "No tolerance for political violence." Tears, prayers and quiet embraces marked the atmosphere. A few described the collapse as divine judgment, reinforcing their belief that the sentence was both lawful and moral. On the other side, critics of the death penalty condemned the celebratory tone among some supporters. They argued that justice should not be equated with suffering and raised ethical concerns about activists and legal reform advocates pointed to the case as a chance to re-examine how America responds to political violence without perpetuating cycles of retribution. Media coverage amplified the divide. National outlets aired footage of the courtroom collapse on repeat, while analysts debated its meaning. Some called it irrelevant to the verdict, insisting that justice had simply taken its course. Others felt the incident humanized Robinson in a way that complicated the public's narrative of villain and victim. On social media, discourse exploded. Hashtags centered around justice, capital punishment, and political extremism trended within hours. The event was no longer just a legal matter. It became a symbol through which Americans projected their fears, politics, and unresolved tensions. Inside Utah and throughout the nation, one reality remained clear. The case no longer belonged to the courtroom alone. Its impact was now cultural, ideological, and deeply personal. As the legal proceedings ended, the impact of the Tyler Robinson sentencing rippled across the country. Politicians, commentators, and activists quickly weighed in, each framing the outcome through their own ideological lens. For conservative leaders and supporters of Charlie Kirk, the ruling represented a firm stand against politically motivated violence. They emphasized that public figures must be protected and that targeted attacks on ideological grounds demand maximum accountability. Progressive voices offered a more cautious interpretation. While most condemned the killing, many urged restraint in politicizing the verdict. Some warned that labeling the crime as part of a broader ideological movement could inflame divisions rather than heal them. Debates about capital punishment also reignited, with opponents questioning whether the death penalty truly serves justice or simply reinforces retaliatory culture. The media's focus extended beyond the sentencing to the cultural and digital forces surrounding the case. Analysts highlighted Robinson's online radicalization, pointing to the troubling role of extremist forums, memes, and ideological echo chambers. His path from quiet youth to convicted assassin became a cautionary story about the dangers of digital influence and polarization. International coverage was equally intense. Broadcasters and newspapers in Europe, Asia, and Latin America framed the case as a reflection of America's growing political volatility. Some compared the assassination to similar acts of ideological violence abroad, while others questioned whether democratic discourse can survive in a climate where rhetoric escalates into fatal action. Meanwhile, institutions across the United States responded pragmatically. Universities and public venues began re-evaluating security protocols for high-profile speakers. Utah Valley University, still haunted by the tragedy, expanded surveillance measures and offered counseling to witnesses and students affected by the incident. Ultimately, the sentencing marked more than the end of a court case. It became a national lesson in extremism, public safety, and social fracture. Charlie Kirk's death and Tyler Robinson's fate now stand as a warning of what happens when ideological outrage goes unchecked, and how justice, security, and civic responsibility must work together to prevent future tragedies.